The prairie wind carried a dry chill across the open land, rattling the tall grass and whispering through the wooden beams of the ranch house. Night was settling in, and with it came the kind of quiet that only old American country knew. The horses were restless in the corral, stamping their hooves and snorting as if they sensed something in the air. Inside the ranch house, the fire burned low, its glow flickering against the rough-hewn walls, casting long shadows that stretched and swayed. It was there in the dim light that she first laid eyes on the man she had been sent to tend. He was seated near the fire, his broad shoulders bent forward, one arm resting on his knee, the other wrapped tight around his ribs. His shirt was torn, stained with dirt and blood, and though he had the look of a man too proud to ask for help, the pain in his eyes gave him away. He did not rise when she entered, did not speak at first, only lifted his head enough for her to see the lines carved deep into his face by years of hard labor, battles with the land, and a past he seemed unwilling to share. The silence between them carried weight. Like two strangers standing on opposite sides of an unseen truth, she had taken the job without much thought, told simply that the rancher needed someone steady, someone who could clean his wounds and see him through the night. Money was promised enough to keep her going for a while, but something about the way the old hand had looked at her, when he passed along the message, told her this was more than simple work. There was a caution in his voice, a hesitation in his eyes. Still, she had come, walking across the dirt yard under a fading sky, with nothing but her small satchel and her own quiet determination. The rancher studied her as she set her things down, the firelight catching strands of her hair and softening her features. She was young, but there was a firmness in her posture, a sense that she had weathered more than her share of storms. She did not flinch at the sight of his injury, nor did she recoil at the blood that had dried against his skin. Instead, she knelt beside him, her hands steady as she drew a cloth from her satchel and dipped it into the basin of warm water she had brought. The air between them seemed to shift as she reached for him, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. When the cloth touched his skin, he winced, but made no sound. She worked carefully, wiping away the dirt, the dried blood, the marks left behind by whatever had torn at him. Yet as she leaned closer, she noticed more than just fresh wounds. Across his chest and shoulders were older scars, some faint and pale, others deep and jagged. They spoke of violence, of struggles far beyond the kind most men admitted to. Some were the kind left by knives, others by fire, and still others by things she could not name. It was as though his body was a map of battles fought in silence, each mark carrying its own story, none of them told. She paused, her eyes lingering on one particularly harsh scar that ran along his side, and for a moment the room seemed colder. He caught her staring, and though his voice was low, it carried a sharp edge when he spoke. "Those ain't for telling." The words hung heavy between them, and she knew better than to press. Still, the thought would not leave her. What kind of life left a man covered in scars like these, sitting alone in a ranch house with no one but the fire for company? She dipped the cloth again, her silence a kind of agreement, though her curiosity only grew. Each time she uncovered another mark, another line etched into his flesh. It felt like stepping deeper into a mystery that had no clear end. Outside, the night grew darker, the coyotes howling in the distance, their cries echoing across the empty land. Inside, the fire popped and crackled, throwing sparks that drifted up into the chimney. She worked quietly, her movements careful, her thoughts restless. The rancher's jaw remained tight, his eyes fixed on the flames as though he feared what might surface if he looked anywhere else. There was something about the way the light hit his face, something that spoke of sorrow more than anger. Though he kept it buried beneath silence and pride, at times she thought he might say more, that he might share the story behind even one of those scars. But each time his lips pressed together, and the chance slipped away. The only sounds were the fire, the soft rustle of her cloth against his skin, and the occasional hiss of pain he tried hard to swallow. She found herself wanting to ask, yet also afraid of the answers. It was clear that his scars were not just wounds of the body, but of the soul. And some truths were heavier than any flesh could carry. She reminded herself why she was there to clean his wounds, to do her work, to take her pay and leave when morning came. Yet as the night stretched on, she realized this was no ordinary task. The air in the room carried a weight she could not name, a quiet warning that whatever had marked this man so deeply was not finished with him yet. The scars were not just memories. They were signs of something still out there, something that might return. Her hands slowed as she wrapped a bandage around his side, her eyes meeting his for the first time without hesitation. There was something unspoken there, a message she could not read, but it was strong enough to send a shiver through her. He did not look away, not until she broke the gaze herself. Tying the cloth tight and retreating into silence, for the first time since she entered, shifted, leaning back slightly, his breath uneven. "You've got steady hands," he said, the words carrying no warmth, but not unkind either. It was as close to gratitude as she thought he would offer. She nodded, unsure what to say in return, and the silence returned, thicker than before. The night was far from over. The firelight danced against the walls, the shadows lengthening and deepening. As though they too held secrets they refused to reveal. She could not shake the feeling that she had stepped into something larger than herself, something dangerous. The scars told one story, but the silence told another. And together they left her with a truth she could not ignore. This man carried more than wounds. He carried a past that refused to stay buried. She finished her work, setting the cloth aside, but her mind was far from done. Questions pressed at her, questions she dared not speak. The rancher leaned forward again, staring into the flames as though he expected answers there. She thought of leaving, of letting the night and the fire swallow the silence whole. But something held her in place. It was then she noticed another scar. Hidden beneath the bandages she had not yet reached, one that seemed fresher than the rest. It curved across his back, sharp and raw, too new to belong to the stories etched long ago. She froze, the cloth in her hand, her breath caught in her throat. The rancher shifted slightly as though he sensed her discovery. And for the first time, his eyes left the fire. They locked onto hers, hard and unreadable, the weight of unspoken truths pressing between them. The air felt thick, the silence heavier than ever. And she knew that whatever story lay behind that scar was not meant for her ears, at least. Not tonight. Yet the question remained, burning hotter than the flames between them. What had he faced in the darkness of the land, and what scars still waited to be made? She did not ask, not yet, but she could feel the answer hanging there. Hidden just beyond the reach of firelight, waiting to reveal itself when the time came, and in that moment, she realized the night was only beginning. The fire had burned lower, shrinking into a red bed of coals, but the warmth still lingered in the room. She sat back from the rancher, folding her hands in her lap, uncertain if she had done enough. The silence stretched on until it became almost unbearable, filled with unspoken things neither of them seemed ready to face. She thought of the scar she had just noticed, the fresh one carved across his back, and wondered who or what had left it there. His eyes were still on her, steady and guarded, as if waiting to see whether she would dare to ask. She didn't. Instead, she busied herself by gathering the cloths and setting the basin aside. Her hands worked slowly, though her mind raced. The air in the cabin was heavy, carrying more than smoke and the sharp temps of blood. It carried secrets, and secrets she knew were often heavier than any wound. The rancher leaned back, exhaling through his nose, his gaze returning to the fire. She wondered what he saw in the flames. Perhaps a memory? Perhaps a face? Perhaps something darker. She could not tell. His silence was not empty, it was deliberate, like a man choosing every breath, every pause. To keep the past from spilling out, outside the wind shifted, carrying the sound of the coyotes closer. She felt the sound in her bones, a reminder of how far they were from the nearest town. From safety, from the hum of other voices. This was land that kept its distance, wide and lonely, and it seemed to suit the man before her. He belonged to it in a way she did not, though she could sense it had taken. She thought back to the moment she had been asked to come here. The message had been quick, passed by one of the ranch hands who barely met her eyes. "He needs tending," the man had said, his voice uneasy. No other explanation, no mention of how the wounds had come. just a push toward the path that led to this very room. She had agreed because she needed the work, because coin was harder to come by than bread, and because she had learned long ago not to question too much when opportunity appeared. But now, sitting in the firelight with the rancher and his scars, she realized this was no ordinary task. She had stepped into something far deeper. Her thoughts wandered to the scars again. They were not the kind a man earned from a lifetime of ranching. Fences, ropes, horses, they left their marks, yes, but not like these. His body carried the story of blades, burns, and battles. A man did not walk through life with such wounds unless he had lived through violence again and again. And yet he was here, quiet and still. As though the weight of those years pressed down on him like the roof above, the rancher's voice broke the silence suddenly.
Oh.
Low and rough. "You're not from here," startled her, though she kept her hands still on her lap. "No," she admitted. "I came south last spring. Work was scarce where I was. Heard there was more need here." He nodded faintly, as if that told him something about her, though she wasn't sure what. His eyes flickered to her satchel, then back to the fire. "You patch up many men before?" "Some," she said softly. "Enough to know when a wound is new and when it's old." She let the words hang, though she half regretted saying them. His jaw tightened, and for a long moment she thought he might send her away. But he only shifted again, turning his face back to the firelight, as if retreating from the truth behind her remark. The coals popped, sending a spark into the air. She watched it fade before speaking again. "Who did this to you?" The words were out before she could stop them. The moment they hung in the air, she felt the weight of them. His head turned, his eyes narrowing, but he said nothing. The firelight made him look carved from stone, his expression fixed and unreadable. She lowered her gaze, scolding herself for asking. But her pulse quickened with the silence that followed. After a long stretch he spoke, his tone flat. "Some things don't need telling." It was the same edge he had used before, sharper now, final. She said no more, though her thoughts tumbled louder than the coyotes outside. Whatever had happened to him was not some passing scuffle. It was part of him, stitched into his skin, into the way he carried himself. And the fresh scar whoever had given him that was not finished yet, she tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself this was work, nothing more. But as the night wore on, her role felt less like tending wounds and more like stepping into a story she had not been meant to hear. Every scar she had seen, every silence he kept, felt like a clue to something buried deep in the rancher's past, and the land outside, wild and unforgiving, seemed to whisper that the past was never truly gone. The fire dimmed lower, the shadows stretching darker along the walls. She could feel the weariness in her body, but she dared not close her eyes. There was something uneasy in the air, as though danger still lingered just beyond the door. The rancher, too, seemed restless, his gaze flicking now and then toward the window, his hand tightening when the wind carried strange noises across the yard. Was it animals? She asked quietly, nodding toward his bandaged side. His eyes slid to hers, sharp assessing. Then he gave a short shake of his head. "No animal."
A dice?
She felt her throat tighten. If not animals, then men. Men who wanted him harmed badly enough to leave him near broken. She thought again of the old scars, the different shapes and lines of them. One man could not be so unlucky to cross so many blades, so many burns, without reason. "You should rest," she said, though her voice betrayed her unease. "Your body needs it." His mouth twitched almost like a bitter smile, but it faded before it could form. Rest doesn't come easy. There was something in the way he said it that chilled her more than the wind outside. A man who could not rest was a man chased. It's not only by enemies, but by memory. She wrapped her shawl tighter around herself, listening as the fire settled into a soft hiss. Her eyes drifted to the shadows near the door, where the light did not reach. She couldn't shake the thought that someone might be out there still, waiting. The rancher's hand moved slowly, pulling his shirt tighter around his chest as if guarding himself not from the cold, but from her questions. His silence told her more than any words could. He was not alone in his past, and whatever he had survived was not done with him yet. The night deepened, the stars hidden behind clouds that pressed low over the land. She knew sleep would not come for either of them. The rancher's breathing was steady but not peaceful, his body tense even in stillness. She could feel her own nerves stretched thin, every sound outside amplified. Every creak of the old wood beneath her feet a reminder that they were not safe. At last, when the fire was little more than a faint glow, he spoke again, his voice softer this time, but edged with something darker. "You shouldn't have come." Her heart jumped at the words, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I was asked to. I took the work." His eyes turned toward her, the firelight catching in their depth. "Sometimes work costs more than it pays." The words lingered like smoke, heavy and unsettling. She wanted to ask what he meant, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she sat still, her breath shallow, her thoughts circling back to the same question. What past could carve a man with scars like his, and what danger still lingered outside their door? The wind rattled the window, and the horses stirred restlessly again. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote gave a long, mournful cry, and another answered. She could not tell if it was the sound of the wild or a warning carried on the night air. Her eyes drifted back to the rancher, who had not moved, his gaze fixed again on the dying fire. His face was unreadable, but his silence told her enough. There were answers she was not meant to know. Not yet. And somewhere beyond the firelight, the truth was waiting, sharp as the scar that ran across his back, ready to show itself when the time came. The night held its breath, and she with it, knowing the story was only deepening, and the danger was far from over. The morning came slow, with a gray haze drifting across the horizon and the faint chill of night still clinging to the earth. The rancher had not moved much, his body stiff, his eyes heavy, though never truly shut. She had stayed near the fire, dozing in the chair with her shawl pulled close, waking each time the wind pressed against the walls or the horses stamped uneasily in the corral. Sleep felt like a luxury they both could not afford. When the first light touched the window, she stirred and noticed him watching, his gaze steady, unreadable. "You'll want to eat," she said, breaking the silence. Though her own voice carried the weariness of the long night, she set about preparing what little she had brought with her bread wrapped in cloth, a bit of dried meat and a small tin of coffee grounds. It was simple fare, but it gave her something to do, a way to avoid the questions crowding her mind. The rancher accepted the food with a short nod. Though he ate little, his movements slow, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. As the fire was stirred back to life, the cabin began to warm again. Yet the warmth did not chase away the unease. She found herself glancing toward the door more than once, as if expecting it to burst open. Something about the way the rancher carried himself, even wounded, told her that trouble had not passed. It lingered just out of sight, waiting. When she finally spoke, her words came carefully. "Whatever put that scar on your back, it was recent. Whoever did it could still be close." He looked at her then, his eyes sharp, the faintest flicker of something buried deep showing through. But instead of answering, he only said, "This land has ears. You'd do well not to speak more than you have to." His warning sent a shiver through her. She wanted to press him, to demand the truth, but the weight in his voice kept her still. She could see now why the ranch hands had looked uneasy, why the old man who delivered the message had spoken with such caution. This rancher was not just a man tending cattle and land. He was someone marked by enemies, by a history that did not. By midday, the air outside had warmed, and the steady clatter of hooves reached the cabin. She tensed, her hand pausing as she rinsed a cloth in the basin. The rancher lifted his head, his jaw tightening. The sound grew closer, the rhythm of more than one horse, until the figures came into view. From the small window, she saw 3 riders approach, dust rising in their wake. They did not look like ranch hands. Her heart quickened as she turned toward the rancher. He had straightened in his chair, despite the pain, his eyes narrowed. "Stay quiet," he said, his voice low but firm. The riders pulled up near the corral, their horses restless under the late sun. She couldn't hear their words, but she could see the way they sat tall in the saddle, scanning the yard with sharp eyes. One dismounted, his boots striking hard against the dirt as he tied his reins. He walked with the slow confidence of a man who had come looking for something and expected to find it. She glanced at the rancher again, waiting for him to rise to meet them, but he did not move. His body was tense, his expression cold, but he stayed seated, his hand resting near the edge of the table where a worn revolver lay half hidden beneath a rag. Her breath caught when she noticed it. He had been ready all along. The knock on the door came heavy, rattling the frame. "Open up," a voice called, deep and commanding. The rancher did not move. He only looked at her, his eyes steady, as if testing whether she would obey. Her hands trembled against her shawl. The knock came again, louder this time. At last he spoke. "Open it." Slow. Her heart pounded, but she rose and lifted the latch. The door creaked open to reveal a man in a long coat, his face lined and weathered, his eyes sharp with suspicion. Behind him, the other two riders lingered. "Watching, mourning," the man said, his tone flat. "We're looking for someone." Heard he might have passed through here. His gaze slipped past her into the room, narrowing when it landed on the rancher. The rancher did not rise. He leaned back slightly, as if the chair itself were a throne he refused to abandon. "You found someone?" he said evenly. The tension snapped tight. The man at the door shifted, his hand brushing the edge of his coat where a pistol hung. The woman felt her throat tighten as she stepped aside, her instinct telling her to flee. "Though her feet would not move, got word you were hurt," the stranger said. His voice calm, though edged with something darker. "Guess that's true. But I'm wondering how much fight you've got left in you." The rancher's jaw clenched. "Enough." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence carried the weight of a standoff, and she could feel it pressing against her chest. Then the stranger's eyes flicked toward her, his stare sharp enough to make her step back. "And who's this?" "Didn't figure you for keeping company?" The rancher's answer came quick, firm. "She don't matter." The words stung, though she knew he said them to deflect attention, to keep her from being drawn into whatever storm hovered over him. But the way the stranger's lips curled told her he wasn't convinced. "Everything matters out here," the man said slowly, his voice low. "Every person, every secret, every scar." His eyes cut back to the rancher. "You know why we're here? This doesn't end until you give us what we came for." Her breath caught at the words. She didn't know what they wanted, but she could see the weight of it in the rancher's face. He said nothing, only stared at the man, his silence a shield. The stranger gave a faint smirk, then stepped back toward his horse. "Think on it," he said. "We'll be close." With that he mounted, and the three riders turned, their hooves striking hard as they rode away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. She closed the door slowly, her hands trembling. The room felt heavier than before, the fire casting long shadows that seemed to lean closer. She turned to the rancher, her voice shaking. "What do they want from you?" His eyes met hers, dark and steady. "What's mine?" he said simply. It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was all he gave. She could feel the danger pressing closer now, the unspoken truth that whatever had carved his scars was still hunting him. As the sun sank lower, she moved about the cabin in silence, her mind heavy with questions. Each glance at him only deepened the mystery. He was not just a man wounded by chance. He was a man bound to something larger, something that had reached even to her hands as she washed his wounds. That night, the wind howled harder, rattling the shutters and stirring the unease that never left her chest. The rancher sat again by the fire, his revolver within reach, his face set like stone. She could not help but wonder if he had once lived by that weapon, if the life he had led had drawn those riders here. When she asked again, softly, almost pleading, what did they mean about scars, he gave no answer. He only lifted the edge of his shirt, just enough for her to see the raw bandages she had wrapped. His eyes held hers, cold but weary, and the silence between them told her more than words ever could. She turned back to the fire, her heart pounding, knowing the truth was close, but not yet ready to be spoken. The riders would return. The scars were not finished telling their story, and she was caught in the middle, bound now to a man who carried his past like a brand in his flesh. The night stretched on, the flames rising and falling, while outside the land seemed to wait, holding its breath for the storm that was surely coming. The days that followed settled into a tense rhythm, though neither of them would have called it peace. The ranch seemed quiet on the surface, but the quiet carried the weight of something waiting just beyond the hills. Each morning she rose before the sun, tending the small fire, boiling coffee, and checking on the bandages. The rancher healed slowly, his body stubborn but strong. Yet the wounds were not the only thing she tended. Each time she caught him staring out the window or pausing at the sound of hoofbeats in the distance, she knew his scars, both old and new, were restless reminders of what lay unfinished. The riders had not returned openly, but their presence lingered. Tracks were found by the creek bed, fresh and deliberate. Twice she saw smoke rising far off, too thin to be from ranch fires, too steady to be wild. And the rancher, though silent, grew sharper with each passing day. He began carrying his revolver at all times, even when stepping outside to feed the stock. He did not need to tell her why. She already felt it in her bones. At night, the unease was heavier. The coyotes cried louder. The wind dragged across the cabin walls like a warning. And the fire seemed smaller against the shadows that crowded the corners. Sometimes she thought she heard horses in the dark, distant but circling. Other times, she was sure someone was watching from the tree line. The rancher never confirmed it, but she noticed how his eyes moved, how his shoulders tensed. He knew as well as she did they were not alone. Her own thoughts grew troubled as she worked. What did they want from him? He had said, "What's mine?" but that was no answer, not truly. Was it land? Cattle? Money? Or something heavier? Something tied to the life that had carved those scars into his flesh? She tried not to ask, but silence only made the questions grow louder. And yet, each time she thought she might press him, his gaze cut through her, warning her back. His past was a locked chest, and she was not sure if opening it would bring answers or danger. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, he spoke without warning. "You're free to go." The words startled her. She had been stirring the pot on the small stove, her hands stilling at the sound of his voice. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his chair, wincing at the pull of his wound. "They'll come soon. You don't need to be here when they do." She shook her head. "And leave you like this?" "No, you're not healed." Muscle tightened in his jaw. "Healed or not, this ends with me." "Not with you." She swallowed hard, her heart pressing against her ribs. His tone was final, but beneath it she heard something else, a faint trace of care. Maybe even fear, not for himself but for her, and it made her decision clearer than before. "I'll stay," she said firmly. For the first time since she met him, his eyes softened, though only for a moment. Then he nodded once, slow and resigned. "Then you'll see the truth, whether you want to or not." The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Each sound outside became sharper, each shadow longer. She began to notice how the rancher paced when he thought she was not looking, how his fingers brushed the revolver's handle like a man rehearsing for a moment he knew was near. His body might have been weakened, but his will was iron. She wondered how many times before he had faced men who wanted him broken. How many nights he had sat by a fire waiting for trouble to ride out of the dark. One afternoon, as she gathered water from the well, she caught sight of something that made her breath stop. Carved into the dirt near the fence line was a mark, nothing natural, nothing accidental. A simple cut into the earth, a sign left behind by a boot heel. It was fresh. Someone had been there, close enough to touch the fence, close enough to see the cabin. When she showed the rancher, he only looked at it for a long moment, then turned back toward the house. "They're closing in," he said quietly. That night, the fire burned brighter than usual, as though they both needed its light. The rancher sat with his revolver across his knee, silent, his eyes never leaving the door. She tried to read, tried to distract herself, but her hands trembled too much. At last she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "What did you do? Why are they—" The flames flickered across his face, deepening the lines, casting shadows into his eyes. For a long time she thought he would say nothing. But then he spoke, low and even. "Some men don't forgive. Not when you've taken something from them." Her stomach tightened. What did you take? He looked at her then, and in his gaze was the weight of years. Peace, he said simply. The answer chilled her more than the wind could. She knew then that this conflict was not about cattle or land. It was older, more personal. It's carved into him as deeply as the scars across his skin. The following morning, the riders returned. This time they did not knock. She heard the thunder of hooves before she saw them, 4 figures now riding hard across the yard, their dust trailing high into the sky. The rancher was already at the window, revolver in hand, his body coiled with tension. She stood frozen by the table, her breath sharp and shallow. The horses pulled up hard, their riders dismounting in unison. She could see the glint of rifles slung across their backs, the grim set of their faces. The same man from before stepped forward, his coat dragging against the dust, his eyes cold. "You've had time to think," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. "You know what we want?" The rancher pushed the window open slightly, resting his revolver on the sill. "You'll get nothing from me." The standoff stretched like a drawn rope ready to snap. The woman felt her knees weaken, her hands clutching the back of the chair to steady herself. The riders spread out, forming a half circle, their rifles shifting casually but not idly. The man in the coat smiled faintly. "You're weaker than you were. That wound will keep you slow. You think you can fight us all off?" The rancher said nothing. His silence was answer enough. The man's eyes slid toward her then, narrowing with interest. "You've got someone with you now. Brave of her, staying here. Foolish, too." But before she could speak, the rancher's voice cut through the air, firm and sharp. "She's not part of this. Leave her be." The man's smirk deepened. "Out here everyone's part of it, even the ones who don't want to be." The tension was unbearable. She could feel it like a storm pressing against the cabin walls, ready to break. The rancher's finger hovered near the trigger, the riders' rifles gleamed in the sun, and the air itself seemed to hold still, waiting for the first spark. Inside, her heart pounded as she realized the truth. Whatever the rancher had done, whatever these men wanted, it would come to blood before it was done. And she was caught in the middle, standing in a firelit cabin, beside a man whose scars told of battles long past but far from over. The man in the coat stepped forward one more pace, his voice lowering into a dangerous calm. "Last chance. Give us what's ours or we take it." The rancher's answer was silence, his eyes steady, his body unflinching. She gripped the chair tighter, her breath sharp, knowing the moment of clash was near. The land outside had gone quiet, even the wind holding still, as though the earth itself waited for the first shot. And in that heavy silence, with firelight flickering behind her and rifles gleaming in the sun outside, she felt the story rush toward its breaking point. The past had caught up. The scars had found their reckoning, and the night ahead promised no peace, only the storm they had both been bracing for. The ranch was quiet after the storm, the kind of quiet that left a person thinking about all that had been endured and all that had been lost. The firelight inside the cabin flickered against the walls, softer now, gentler than on those first nights when she had sat nervously near him, unsure of his temper, his silence, or the strange burden he carried. Now the same fire seemed to breathe with relief, as if it too understood that the hardest part had been crossed. She sat by the table, her hands folded around a cup. Watching the rancher who had once been just a stranger with wounds she was hired to tend. He was no longer only that. He was a man she had come to understand, even if some scars would never fully heal. The land outside bore marks of the fight they had faced. Tracks in the dirt, broken branches, and reminders of the men who had come seeking what was not theirs to take. The rancher had stood his ground, not out of pride but out of duty, and in the middle of it all, she had been there, pulled into a struggle she had not chosen, yet one that revealed strength inside her she had not known she carried. The long nights of worry, the moments of doubt, the fear of what would come with every shadow had tested them both. Now, sitting there, she felt the weight lifting, though not gone completely. Peace was never so simple in the old frontier. He moved slowly, his shoulders still stiff, though healing. She noticed the way he carried himself, still cautious, as if expecting another fight could rise up any moment. That was the kind of man he was, molded by years of hardship, by losses he never spoke of except in fragments. She had seen the pain in his eyes, the kind no wound dressing could ever touch. Yet she also saw something else that night. In the firelight's glow, a quiet gratitude, maybe even a trust he had not given anyone in a long while. The cattle in the far fields still needed tending. The fences mended and the work of the ranch pressed on, as it always did. But something in the air was different now. Where before there had been only tension and unspoken questions, there was now a bond formed in the crucible of trial. She remembered the first time she saw him wince at her touch, when she cleaned his wounds. How he turned his face away as if ashamed to need help. And now, here they were, sharing silence that felt less like distance and more like understanding. She asked him once again, softly, about the scars on his chest, the ones not made by the recent fight. He looked into the fire for a long time before speaking. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of memory. He told her of battles long before she came, of men who had turned on him, of land he had fought to keep, and of family he had buried. Each scar was a story, not one he offered icily. But this time he gave her enough to know why he lived with the guard always raised. He said the firelight made it easier to speak, as if the shadows could take some of the heaviness from him. Her heart ached at his words. It's not out of pity, but out of respect for the way he had endured. She thought of how many men had been broken by less, how many had given up or turned cold. He had carried on, scarred but unyielding. She realized then that tending his wounds had never been only about his body. It was about trust. It's about reminding him he did not have to carry it all alone. The days that followed brought small moments of normal life back. She helped in the kitchen, cared for the horses, and kept the cabin warm. He worked when his strength allowed, slow but steady. The townsfolk who had once whispered about the rancher's quiet and hardened ways began to look differently when they saw them together in the market. She noticed their curious glances, their hushed tones. The old stories about him were giving way to new ones. People were beginning to see what she had come to know, that beneath the scars was a man still capable of loyalty and quiet strength. One evening, as the sun sank low, painting the fields in gold, he walked with her along the fence line. He paused, looking out across the wide land, and for the first time in her presence he smiled, faint but real. He told her that the ranch had nearly been lost, not just to the men who came against him, but to his own silence. He admitted that had she not stayed, had she not faced the danger at his side, he might have given up the fight. Those words, so simple, held more weight than any promise. She thought about her own journey, how she had come there for work, expecting nothing more than the task of tending to a wounded man. She had not expected to find herself caught in his battles, nor to feel her life tied so deeply with his. But sometimes the land gave more than hardship. It gave connection. It gave meaning. And it reminded those who lived upon it that every scar carried a story worth remembering as the fire crackled that night. She sat with him one last time before the season turned. The shadows danced across his face, showing both the hard lines of the man he had been and the softer traces of the man he was becoming. She knew the road ahead would not be free of struggle. The frontier never allowed that kind of peace for long. Yet, in that moment, there was no fear between them. The story that began with wounds and silence had become something far stronger. When dawn came, the light spilled across the plains, brighter than it had felt in a long while. The ranch stood tall, scarred like the man who kept it, yet unbroken. She carried with her the memory of those long nights, the firelight, the trust slowly built, and the knowledge that some wounds heal best, not through medicine alone, but through the steady presence of another soul. And so, as the cattle stirred and the fields waited for another day's work, their story found its quiet end. Not in grand declarations, not in promises shouted to the sky, but in the steady truth of survival, trust, and the unspoken bond between two lives that had crossed when they least expected. The fire that once revealed scars now burned softly, a reminder of how far they had come. The rancher's silence was no longer a wall, but a place where her voice could rest beside his, and together they faced whatever the land might hold.